It's on a text today, but don't, if you're not into texts or history, there's quite a lot of history as well. Don't be put off by that. There's all kinds of different modules, practical modules. There's an online retreat. There's things on obviously Pure Land doctrinal stuff and the workings of the Amida order. So there's a lot of variety. So this is just one sample. So don't be put off either by my face, because you won't see that most of the time if you do Vow 22. And certainly don't be put off if this topic today is not of central interest to you. We've been doing Vow 22 for several years. It was started by Dhamma and various people have worked on it over the years, including Sistama. And we at the moment we deliver it by sharing modules on Dropbox, but that hasn't proved terribly. It's proved useful as a kind of interim measure, but it's we're now moving over to Google Classroom, which can be more interactive, and that's a new. Pretty and Sistama are very supportive over that, and this is very much a new kind of venture for us. And I'll give you a little bit more detail about that at the end. So a little bit of sort of housekeeping stuff, really. I've been like people always come on the Zoom and talk about their technical difficulties, and so I'm not alone in that. But if I suddenly disappear for any reason, I will be back. It's only because of a technical hitch. Although I've talked on Zoom before, I've never attempted to show a few slides. It's not really, you couldn't call it a PowerPoint presentation, but there are a number of little slides that I would like you to look at, and I'm going to try in a minute to do that. If you could there will be opportunity for you to talk to me, and please do talk to me. But if for the moment you could mute yourselves, that would be great. I just want you to bear in mind before a couple of things as well. Firstly, I'm not a Buddhist teacher in the sense that Dhammavijaya and Sistama are Buddhist teachers. This is not a Dharma talk. It's a kind of my function as a learning mentor on Vow 22 is to kind of interest people in Pure Land and a bit of Pure Land history and try to offer kind of academic, although I'm a bit scared of that word, but a bit of academic in inverted commas support. So bear in mind that this is not me kind of preaching the Dharma to you. It's a kind of, it's an attempt to explain some of what Pure Land is about and has been about and where it's come from and all the rest of it. You don't need to take notes. I mean, it's in fact, in some ways, I'd rather you didn't take notes. I'd rather you just kind of listened, because I'm trying to structure this as a bit of a narrative today, a bit of a storytelling type of thing, really. You can take notes by all means if you want to, but there's quite a lot of Japanese names and terms and stuff, which I don't want you to become demoralized if you can't write those down, and I don't want to turn it into just a PowerPoint. So, and if you do the course, of course, you'll get a chance to spend more time over these Japanese words and all the rest of it. But as far as I'm concerned this morning, I'd kind of rather you listened, and there will be a bit of writing if you want to do it on the participation thing, but the main thing I think is just to listen. And this is the first lesson in a series called Key Pure Land Texts. And that's not about the Pure Land Sutras. Those are dealt with in separate modules, and it's more about people who've commentated in different ways on Pure Land, although the distinction between a commentary and a sacred text is very kind of blurred on a lot of occasions. And of course, Ichimaika Shomon is, I would certainly view it as a sacred text, and I guess a lot of other people would as well. But I'm not looking so much at the meaning of the text, although of course that's highly important. I'm more concerned with how the text came to be produced, and who produced it eventually, how do we come to know about this text to kind of enrich our understanding of it, and also how we might use it. I don't mean use it in a kind of exploitative way, but how we might think about it, meditate on it, view its applicability to our own lives, and so on and so forth. So the Dharma is constant, if you like, throughout time. Truth is truth, but the way this truth manifests itself to us takes different forms. And Buddhist scriptures are quite fluid and have been throughout history. Different ones have been admitted to the canon and then excluded for kind of political reasons and so on and so forth. And so if we listen out for these texts and listen out for the underlying Dharma, we can see how at different times in history, texts have played out within our own practice and with people in the past. And I think by looking at how texts have been used in the past, you can kind of get a real solidarity with people from the past. You know, the Sangha is not just you and I gathered here together today, but it's a history, it's a tradition, which is kind of moving forward all the time. Okay, and now what I'm going to try and do now is something really daring, which is to share my screen with you. Now, just bear with me for a minute because I haven't done this. If this fails, I'll just come back and you'll have my face to look at, I'm afraid, but I'm going to try and look at that. Right. Okay. Now, I don't know if you can you see that okay? Can you see that okay? Yep, that's fine. Brilliant. Okie doke. Right, so this is about this text called Ichimaika Shonen, which basically means one sheet testament or one sheet document, one page document. Sometimes it's known as the covenant, sometimes it's known as the single sheet covenant. So there's all these kind of different names to it according to who's writing about it, really. And it was dictated by Honen to his disciple Seikanbo Genshi in Kyoto in Japan on January the 23rd, 1212. 2 days later, Honen died at the age of 80. It's very brief. I hope you managed to read it. If you haven't, I think I can show it to you now. No, I can't show it to you now. Why is that doing that? Oh, there we go. Yes. So if you haven't seen it or you want to kind of refresh your memory of it, there it is. This is a particular translation, of course. Other translations differ slightly in the wording. So what are we going to do? It's a very, on the face of it, it's a very simple, straightforward text with a very simple, straightforward message. We're encouraged to take what Honen says here at face value. It's asking us to do something very specific and very dear to us, which is basically practice the Nembutsu, the calling out to Amida Buddha, the taking refuge in Amida Buddha. And it kind of discourages us from a certain type of intellectualism or scholasticism. It's saying that, you know, scholasticism and intellectual approaches to the Dharma have their place, but they're not fundamentally what it's all about. So what I want to do is look at how the context in which this came to be produced. I've already said it's a deathbed text. Religions and history generally, I suppose, are full of people making sort of final statements or definitive statements about what they want to be their legacy or their testament, what they want to leave behind them. Again, I used to do this with the kids at school. People will say all sorts of significant things on their deathbed or alleged to have said these significant things. And I think there was a famous writer, and I can't remember who it was now, but it was an 18th century novelist, I think, who said his famous last words were, "I just fancy a slice of my grandmother's apple pie," you know. So I think those are the sorts of last words that you could go with sometimes. And we expect people to say these very profound things. And of course, there's been a tendency among religious figures to, hello, pussycat, a tendency among religious figures to say, look, don't worry about me dying. It's not me that's important. It's the message that is important. And this is certainly true of Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, who was tried to take attention kind of off himself, if you like, as a personality, and just reminded, according to the scriptures, it reminded people of his own impermanence and said, subject to change are all component things, strive on with heedfulness. So it's a kind of, don't worry about me. It's not, my passing is not that important. It's the Dharma that lives on after us. It's the truth and the spirit that live on. So, and great religious teachers kind of disclaim any, they don't want to be glorified as a god in their own right, or and Buddhist teachers in particular emphasize impermanence. Shinran famously wanted his remains to be fed to the fishes in the Kamu River in Kyoto, and not have a big fuss made. So Honen's writing in Ichimoku Shomon is very, very much in that tradition. Now, if you come to do Vow 22 as a course, there are Dhammavidya teaches about Honen's early life quite a lot. So I'm not going to focus on his early life today. I want really to focus on the story of the last few years, but I will give you a bit of background now if you like. So Honen was born, just to use the early years, go through the early years quite quickly, in 1133. And so as you see from that, he died when he was approaching 80, if not 80, 79/80. So he had a good run, if you like. And his father was variously described either as a warrior or a constable, but he had that kind of function. And famously, nobody's quite exactly sure when this happened. Honen's age at the time is given differently in different texts, but he could have been as young as 7 when his dad was killed in what's called a night raid, and he was as a fatherless child, he was packed off to a fairly local monastery for the monks to look after him. And in 1145, he went to the famous Tendai Buddhist temple on Mount Hiei, which is right next to Kyoto. You can see Kyoto from the top of it. And he received a very scholastic education as a young Tendai priest. He was famous for his determination to go through all the collective scriptures, the Vijnana, several times. He was known as a great scholar, and that was his life. And he had a certain kind of spiritual discontent, and I think most, again, I'm generalizing, but if you look at other traditions, Christian traditions, most religious teachers, if you take Luther, for example, in Germany at the time of the Christian Reformation, people are driven by a sense of spiritual discontent. They know the tradition they want to work in and practice in, but there's something not quite right. Something doesn't quite click with them, really. And so Honen did all this studying of sutras and texts and felt that he was not there, hadn't arrived. He wasn't satisfied. There was a kind of itch that he couldn't scratch, if you like. And until he discovered Shantao, who's a Chinese teacher of the Tang dynasty, that's sort of 300 or 400 years before Honen's time. He discovered that Shantao had written a commentary on the Contemplation Sutra and the Meditation Sutra. And Shantao was I think it's fair to say, the first Pure Land teacher who stressed the value of reciting the Nembutsu as opposed to using it as a tool of visualization or meditation. But Shantao was keen on recitation. Okay, and Honen came across the vows, and realized that here was a practice that he could relate to and that ordinary people could relate to. You didn't have to be a scholar. You didn't have to be pure in body and mind. You didn't have to have wealth to donate to a temple, but you could recite the Nembutsu. And in 1175, he came down from Mount Hiei, which was this very significant sacred mountain where lots was going on academically in Buddhism as well as ritualistically, I suppose it's fair to say. And he came down into the city, into Kyoto. And it's from that time, he's supposed to have had a dream of Shandao, and he came down from Mount Hiei, Honen came down from Mount Hiei. And it's from that time that we date Jodo Shu, the founding of Jodo Shu. Honen didn't actually want to found an order as such, but retrospectively, people look back on it and say, well, yeah, this is the time when he stressed the value of exclusively practicing the Nembutsu, and so we can date the founding of Jodo Shu, Honen's school, from that time. Okay, now it's quite important, and I think this is where we start to get a sense of what life was really like for Honen as a living, breathing human being, because Kyoto at the time was plagued by all sorts of life-threatening things, like plagues themselves, but also famines and great fires. Japanese cities were, as indeed a lot of cities were at that time, largely built of wood, houses close together, and people died terrifying deaths in fires, minor earthquakes, famines, and so on and so forth. So in terms of samsara, you know, Honen was kind of coming down off the mountain and sharing the same kind of life that everybody else in the city was having. And I think it's important to realize that. I think sometimes we tend to think that religious figures kind of think great thoughts because they're sitting on a meditation cushion or are cloistered in prayer, whereas a lot of the stimulus for Honen's work, and indeed for the text that we're looking at today, a lot of the stimulus for that came from encounters with suffering. And I think that's so important. And he also, Dhammavidya and I listened to a lecture by a guy called Mark Bloom not long ago about Honen. And the fascinating thing about this lecture was, again, it situated Honen in real life, really. And he, like, I hadn't realized half these things. Like, for example, in 1186, Honen went to a suburb of Kyoto called Ohara. And he formally debated with a Tendai priest the value of Nembutsu. And by all accounts, he kind of won, in inverted commas, this debate. And I tended to think that this debate was, you know, very formally structured and kind of silent and rigorously academic, if you like. Whereas, in fact, Mark Bloom pointed out that Ohara was a region of Kyoto which was known as a besho, or separate place. And these places, Ohara was kind of almost wasteland. It's countryside today, apparently. I've been to Kyoto, but I haven't been to this particular area. And it's countryside today, but it was wasteland then, and land that was owned by various temples, but not used. And it had kind of semi-ruined buildings in it. And it was frequented by all kinds of down and outs, really, performers, singers, actors, kind of renegade priests, and hijiri, wandering holy people who, there's a great tradition of hijiri, as you probably know, in Japanese Buddhism, with Koya, who was before the time of Honen, and then Ippen, who was after the time of Honen, who wandered around preaching and I suppose you could view them as kind of eccentric and non-affiliated, although that's not quite true, but at certain times in their life, both Koya and Ippen were unaffiliated to major organizations. So, you know, O'Hara wasn't a kind of, as far as I can gather from what Mark Bloom said, wasn't a kind of university atmosphere where everybody sat quietly and respectably and listened to the Dharma, listened to this great O'Hara debate. But it was far more, there was far more kind of cut and thrust going on and trying to address people's needs and so on and so forth. And alongside Beshu, Mark Bloom mentioned this other word, Sanjo, which refers to both a place which is sometimes used and sometimes isn't, and also to kind of wandering poor people who were without regular employment, or they may have had employment in trades and jobs which were not very well looked upon, shall we say, and they were kind of ostracized because people who looked after dead animals or people who buried the dead or stuff like that were quite frequently ostracized. And O'Hara as a region, I think, had quite a few people like that living in it. So this is the kind of environment in which Honen came down from the mountain and preached, if you like. Now, if we move on a little bit to, well, first of all, we can mention that to give it a bit of context, in 1201, Shinran, who later obviously became famous, became Honen's disciple. So just to 1201 was when Shinran became Honen's disciple. If you want a bit of kind of perspective on I'm looking at now at the period from about 1204 to Honen's death in 1212. If you want a bit of context on it, this is the time when Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes were entering China. If you have any contact with that part of the world, that's what was going on then. In England, we had King John, who by Universal Gazette was a bad king, in inverted commas, was having to sign the Magna Carta with his barons, who he had to reach an accommodation. He couldn't exercise sole power himself as a king, but he had to deal with his powerful barons. So that was going on in England at the time. And as well as the natural disasters in Kyoto, there were huge power struggles going on. And I think that's worth saying as well. There was an ongoing, or there had been, an ongoing war between two rival clans, the Tairas and the Minamotos. In 1185, the Minamotos kind of won that. And but there was a general atmosphere of violence. This is what I'm trying to say, not just of natural disasters. Some of the bigger temples on Mount Hiei had soldier monks who had no hesitation in fighting with soldier monks from other temples. So it was quite a dangerous time to be alive. And in 1192, when the Minamoto finally started their rule in Japan, this is the start of the Kamakura era in Japan, and the time of the shoguns. You probably heard the word shogun or the bakufu. And Honen, Buddhism was very political, and Honen had to keep in with the power, or didn't have to keep in, but he did keep in with the powers that be, because Kanizane, who was both the brother of the leading Tendai monk at the time and very high up in the power structure in the Bakufu, he became Honen's sponsor and protector to a certain extent. Okay, so if we move on now to 1204, Honen's preaching of the Nembutsu as an exclusive practice had begun to worry the authorities. Now, this is quite a complex issue, but again, it makes you realize that Honen must have, for the authorities to have been worried, Honen must have gained a substantial following among ordinary people. And I think, politicians fear strength of numbers, big demonstrations and so on and so forth. And so he must have rattled people's bars. And of course, I mean, it's easy to exaggerate, I think. Sometimes Honen is viewed as a Reformation figure who kind of rejected all of the teachings of the highly ritualized Tendai school and suddenly started something new. And it's not quite for the ordinary people. It's not quite as simple as that, really, because Nembutsu practice had been part of these traditional Buddhist schools. I think what people objected to or found threatening about Honen was that he emphasized the exclusive nature of Nembutsu practice. And he appeared to, or his supporters uses as an excuse to denigrate other practices. And Honen, when the monks on in Rakuji on Mount Hiei wanted to ban Nembutsu, Honen had to reprimand his followers who had been slandering other teachers, who had been using the teaching of the exclusive Nembutsu in an appropriate way to denigrate other teachers and teachings. And it was that exclusive nature of the Nembutsu that people found threatening. Now, of course, it's not quite true to say that Honen only taught the Nembutsu. He taught all kinds of things, but he came back to the Nembutsu and prioritized it. But there were other teachings going on at the time which kind of found their focus in the Nembutsu. There were other controversies as well. Even people who believed in the exclusive practice of the Nembutsu started to worry about whether you should just do one Nembutsu, was that sufficient, or should you do many? And there's one of Honen's riposte to this was that basically if you only did one Nembutsu, then your faith was standing in the way of your practice. And if you did lots of too many, well, not such a thing as too many Nembutsu, but if you just thought that you were relying on the number of Nembutsu that you were chanting, then your practice was kind of interfering with your faith. So Honen wanted a kind of a balance between this. So eventually, because of all these problems, although Honen had admonished his supporters who he felt had misrepresented him, Honen himself was sent into exile. Two of his followers in Raku and Jurin were beheaded. Actually, they allegedly entertained ladies of the court inappropriately. And at the time when Honen was exiled to the island of Shikoku, his two followers were beheaded. It has been said as well, and Donavidio reminded me of this, that he perhaps never arrived in exile in Shikoku, but he may have stayed with friends in Osaka at the same time, at that time, instead of actually fulfilling the terms of his exile. Before he was exiled, he was stripped of his status as a Buddhist priest. And that was because it was deemed bad karma to send a priest into exile. But if you kind of defrocked them first and then sent them into exile, that was kind of okay. But again, in terms of seeing Honen's life in the round, as it were, the accounts in the sources say that, he was seen off or sent off into exile and by people weeping in the streets. His supporters gathered en masse, men, women, hijiri, itinerant teachers, performers I keep coming back to this kind of idea of performance, but I think sometimes the Nembutsu is very close to being theatrical. I don't mean to diminish its sacred status by saying that, but it was performed. There were monks whose specific function was to sing using a kind of form of lute at the time. There was other people engaged in dancing, both before Honen and after Honen, not Honen himself, I don't think, but people engaged in dancing Nembutsu. So that there's kind of a why we tend to think that it doesn't particularly matter the form the Nembutsu takes, I think would be Honen's view. But as long as that sacred intent is there and that faith is there. So there's kind of, I've learned that that the Nembutsu was not just about a guy sitting in isolation on his meditation mat chanting, or even a group of people sitting formally chanting. That certainly happened, but people's engagement with Nembutsu was much more fluid than that. And I think we see that when Honen went into exile. Okay, now in 1211, he returned to Kyoto. And again, I mean, he was getting on, okay. Kyoto was still a turbulent place, was still afflicted by natural disasters. And I suppose his thoughts, if they hadn't already, would be turning towards his death. He fell ill in January 1212. And it's said in the sources that this was due to the difficulties of his exile. So it must have affected him badly, negatively. It's quite unspecific about what he was actually suffering from, but his disciples nursed him. There could have been, again, I thought, you know, when he said his disciples nursed him, I thought they perhaps had 2 or 3 guys who took it in turns to look after him and so on. But there could have been as many as 200 disciples accompanying him at this time. The most eminent of whom was Bensho, who was a chap who'd been his disciple since 1197, and it was to succeed him as patriarch of Jodo Shu, the Pure Land School. And there was Genshi, who we'll hear about again in a few minutes. Now, according to the sources, Honen was unable to eat very well, although mysteriously he reported an improvement in his powers of sight and hearing as death approached. His sight and his hearing had apparently been in decline for several years, but they kind of revived when he got back to Kyoto. Again, the sources talk of him as literally constantly reciting the Nembutsu, that his lips were moving even in his sleep, reciting the Nembutsu. And again, I think this is so significant, because although we know, I'm talking about us now, kind of intellectually, that reciting the Nembutsu continuously is what we should be doing and is a good idea. Part of us perhaps in daily life thinks, oh, well, you know, I'll recite the Nembutsu later, or I can't possibly do it while I'm driving or whatever. But Honen seems to have, certainly by the account, seemed to have actually, put his money where his mouth is, if you like, and really, really committed to this continual recitation to himself of the Nembutsu. In his last days, I'll try and find a picture of this. I'll come back to that one in a minute. This is Honen's last moments. Well, we haven't quite reached there yet, but let's just take this as imagine this is a picture of a few days before he died. You can see that he was, according to this source, kind of surrounded by, there he is lying down, facing the direction of the Pure Land. His disciples and others, there's quite a variety of people there in the picture, just congregating and I suppose waiting for the worst. People had audiences with him. He was often questioned about what they should do after his death. And again, like we've said before, he said he didn't want a memorial temple. He wasn't interested in apotheosis, about being treated as a god. He said, the one purpose of my life has been the universal spread of the Nembutsu. So wherever among the high class or low you find a Nembutsu community, there is my memorial temple. And he said he could see the Bodhisattvas Kannon and Seishi in front of him, waiting to receive him. That's the slide we just looked at. This is many of you are familiar with this. It used to be on the front of the Amida Order's service book. And there's Amida waiting for the practitioner to die. That's a large number of bodhisattvas in this particular picture, but he's often accompanied by Seishi and Kannon. So he said that he had a strong visual sense of them waiting to receive him. And people around him said, well, we can't, again, according to the sources, people around him said, we can't see him. And he said, well, you could if you just keep going with the Nembutsu, you'll get there. You'll hang on in there. You'll see what I see. So he was still kind of inspiring people. And he went on, as a result of the merit of repeating the sacred name, I have for the past 10 years continually been gazing upon the glory of the Pure Land and the very forms of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But I've kept it secret and said nothing about it. Now, however, as I draw near the end, I disclose it to you. On the 20th of January, purple clouds were reported to have appeared over his room. Now, purple clouds are traditionally, and flowers from heaven as well, are traditionally thought to accompany the death of an especially holy person. For some reason, Ippen challenged that. Ippen, who was later on after Honen, he wasn't sure about that, and he said, "Don't worry about the purple clouds." But certainly, at Honen's death, the purple clouds were thought to be very, very significant. Now, his disciple Genshi requested, as the end was getting near, requested an ambiguous clarification and memento of Honen's teaching. His disciple went to him and said, look, please, can you summarize what you believe in and what we should take from your life and your teachings before you go? And some people say that this was delivered in Honen's own hand. Some people say it was delivered to Genshi and then authenticated by Honen's handprint and signature. So I'm not sure about that. But anyway, this is his final testament. So if I could just put that back on the screen for a minute so we can have a look at it, because this is what is produced, and I want to read it through with you, because again, to try and make it come alive. So this is the final summing up statement of a person who had lived through. He lived in the real world. He lived through some samsara. He hadn't had an easy life. He had a long life. I think what he'd been through and what was coming concentrated his mind like it would for any of us. And if we just read through it, and I'll mention something else in a minute. It talks here, before I start, it talks about the threefold preparation of mind and the four practical rules. I'll talk about those later on, not at this point. I just want to read the whole thing through it a minute and just see what you think. The method of final salvation that I have propounded is neither a sort of meditation, such as has been practiced by many scholars in China and Japan, nor is it a repetition of the Buddha's name by those who have studied and understood the deep meaning of it. It is nothing but the mere repetition of the Namo Amida Butsu, without a doubt of his mercy, whereby one may be born into the land of perfect bliss. The mere repetition with firm faith includes all the practical details, such as the threefold preparation of mind and the four practical rules. If I as an individual have any doctrine more profound than this, I should miss the mercy of the two honorable ones, Amida and Shaka, and be left out of the vow of Amida Buddha. Those who believe this, though they clearly understand all the teachings Shaka, that Shakyamuni, taught throughout his whole life, should behave themselves like simple-minded folk who know not a single letter, or like ignorant nuns or monks whose faith is implicitly simple. So without pedantic airs, they should fervently practice the repetition of the name of Amida, and that alone. My favorite bit about that is about the simple-minded folk who know not a single letter, or like ignorant nuns or monks whose faith is implicitly simple. I mean, that brings alive, I think, these, when I talked about the Beshos, this kind of wasteland environment and mixing with ordinary people. I think when I mentioned that, you see now where he's coming from. You know, these are the people with whom he's been mixing. They're not the only people with whom he's been mixing, but they are the sort of folks that he has had around him. Now, what I would like you to do, and this is a private thing, I'm not going to ask you to share this. I'm just going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to kind of thinking about this. Is, you know, we live in very different times from Honen's. You know, Honen believed in Mappo, in the theory that he, you know, that we were, or he was so far away from the time of the historical Buddha that gaining enlightenment was very, very difficult. And this is one of the reasons why he valued Nembutso so highly. But although Honen lived in a very different time from us, he also, you know, we live in a time which is afflicted by viruses, with environmental challenges, with, and, you know, and on top of all that kind of background, we have our own personal difficulties and tragedies and losses and so on and so forth. And what I want you to consider now is that, put yourself in Honen's place. I know none of us are, apart from Dhammavidya and Sastama, none of us are great religious leaders, but if we put ourselves in the place, and there may come a time when, fairly soon, let's say, when we're separated from our loved ones for whatever reason, what would your message to your loved ones be? If you just, I'm not going to get you to share this because it's kind of deeply personal, but I'd just like you to reflect for a couple of minutes, and you can write it down or whatever. But if you had to sum up for your loved ones what your core philosophy is, you know, what your core hope for them is, what you think will bring them salvation, what would you write? What would you put? And I'm just going to leave you, well, I'm not going to leave, I'm still here, but I'll just leave you to do that for 3 or 4 minutes. What would your testament be? I don't want to make this too gloomy. I'm not assuming that we're all going to kind of suddenly disappear, but what would your message be? And you might want to develop that yourselves later on, but what I was trying to do with that really is to think, you know, how you could use Ichimaika Shomen in your own practice, in your own work with other people. Pastorally, if you felt that somebody was, you know, on the verge of a significant event in their life, how could you use this text with them, really, to kind of reassure or to tell them that they're not on their own, or whatever. So if we just come back to Honen for a minute, on January the 25th, he passed away. And again, he was said to be peacefully chanting the Nembutsu as he died. And after his voice was silent, his lips and tongue continued moving for a short while a bright smile came over his face. After his death, his disciples built a tomb next to his meditation hermitage, but this was destroyed by soldier monks from Mount Hai sometime between 1217 and 1222. So again, all the kind of factional stuff and the fear of exclusive Nembutsu practice and the challenge that mounted to the establishment didn't kind of cease with his death. Indeed, it intensified for a while. 3 of his disciples were exiled again. And following this, other disciples removed their beloved teacher's remains and cremated them. Then in 1234, the ever-faithful Genshi repaired Honen's original gravesite and interred his remains there. Close by, Genshi built the original Chionin temple buildings. In Kyoto, Honen was declared to have been the founder of the temple, with Genshi as the second chief high priest. So there's all this rather unsavory moving poor old Honen's remains around. And it shows, again, a concern with relics, which is very common in medieval Japan, a concern with the relics of significant teachers should be respected and preserved if at all possible. So what does all that tell us? Well, it tells us that of the centrality for Pure Land Buddhism of the Nembutsu. It reminds us of that. And it reminds us that Honen and his supporters faced persecution, misunderstanding, anxieties about health, fears about what would happen after Honen's death. And if you do this module on Vow 22, one of the questions I ask you to consider is, why was Ichimai Shomen so short? It wasn't that Honen didn't have things to say, okay? For example, it talks about the threefold preparation of mind. Now, the threefold preparation of mind was stressed by Shandao. It comes from the Pure Land scriptures, and it's about genuine heart or sincere heart, and it's about deep and profound heart, and it's about dedication of merit. Now, I don't want to go into all those things at the moment, but those 3 are the ones that were stressed by Shandao, what Shandao took from the scriptures. And Honen, it wasn't that Honen hadn't written about those in detail at any other place. He'd written about those at length in his book on the selection of the vow, and he'd also written at length about the 4 practical rules. Now, the 4 practical rules are, if I can just read these to you: treating with profound reverence and respect all sacred objects, practicing nothing but the Nembutsu, leaving no intervals of time between the Nembutsu repetitions, but keeping them up continuously, and the continued practice throughout one's whole life of the foregoing 3. Now, notice that Honen in Ichimai Shomen, he doesn't say that the threefold preparation of mind and the 4 practical rules aren't important. And indeed, he wrote about them at length elsewhere, as I've said. What he said was that if you are practicing the Nembutsu with sincere faith, then those will automatically be encompassed in your Nembutsu practice. So this is a kind of shorthand, if you like, and it emphasizes the fact that it was one of the reasons that it's brief is that it's a message from a battlefield. There are all these things going on in Honen's life and in Kyoto. And I said it was scribbled in haste as the wagons were circling, that no one knew what was going to happen to the order after Honen's death. No one knew about power struggles or about doctrinal differences, what would happen. And this just heightened the anxiety. Now, I want to just finish before I ask you, I'm mindful of the time, before I ask you for any questions you may have. Some of you may be asking the question that all good historians ask, which is, how do we know all this? And I just wanted to finish by saying that I think it's fair to say that today we know much more about Shinran than we do about Honen. But in fact, Honen, during his lifetime, or just after his lifetime rather, there was a huge amount of biographical material produced about him. So this is the descriptions of his deathbed scene and the kind of poetic, devotional aspects of it, which may strike us as implausible. And of course, there is something of an agenda there to, this is describing the death of a hugely significant and revered religious figure. But we might think, oh, well, there's a bit of poetic license. But okay, that's true. But there is a lot of biographical material which has been put together since the time of Honen about his life. And there are three, I don't want to kind of bore you with all the details of this, but give you three examples, the three most prominent ones. Well, first of all, Genshi, the chap who Ichimai Shomen was dictated to, or he was the guy who requested the teaching. Genshi himself wrote a biography of Honen Shonin, which was published around about 1342, which is about 30 years after Honen's death. And now, obviously, his recollections are quite, are reliable, or could be thought to be reliable in the sense that he was there. He was an eyewitness. So that's one significant biography of Honen. There's another one written by a chap called Ryo Doko, who was born in 1243, just to give you an idea of time. He was a leading disciple of Ryocho, and who was the third patriarch in Honen's lineage. And Ryocho himself had received Honen's teaching from Bensho. So there's a kind of lineage there. And this chap Doko was very concerned about what he felt were misinterpretations of Honen and the Nembutsu. And he searched for about 20 years. He didn't kind of make things up. He searched for 20 years in Kyoto for documentary evidence about Honen's life, and compiled this compilation to try and set the record straight about what Honen's life and death had been like. So, and his edition was published about 100 years after Honen's death. So although it was a century after Honen's death, we can give some credence to its reliability by the fact that he was quite a scrupulous researcher, this chap Doko. And then finally, in terms of these main editions, there was an edition prepared by Shunjo, who was a 14th century Buddhist priest, and that was written at imperial request. And this chap Shunjo produced 48 volumes of material drawn from interviews with and writings of Honen's disciples. And it's said that after he put all that together, the literary style was polished by experts at the imperial court. And this is the text. This is the original manuscript is kept at the Chionin temple in Kyoto, and it forms the basis of. There are not 48 volumes of this, but some of you will be familiar with this Honen the Buddhist saint book. So that's a great abbreviation of these 48 volumes. And I'm just saying this because people sometimes do say, how do we know all this, or where does this stuff come from? And you may have your own opinions on what's reliable and what's not reliable. And I often think, if somebody was writing my life, not that they'd be interested in writing about what sources would they use? Who would they go to? Who would they talk to in terms of my existence? Right. So what I've tried to do is to just rate. No pretensions to having covered all the issues to do with Honen, but just to situate this text in his life, show how it's it's not just a piece of paper, but it emerged out of a living context of Buddhist practice, and and tell the story of Honen's last few years and how information was put together about him after his death.